As you guys probably know by now, Ken Block recently passed away in a very tragic snowmobiling accident on January 2nd, 2023. Obviously, you guys probably know Ken Block was an extremely influential figure in the automotive and action sports worlds, helping found DC Shoes as well as Hoonigan Industries. He was extremely talented in a plethora of things, including rallycross driving, drifting, and just generally having fun, and he helped to cultivate a much larger automotive community through his various Gymkhana videos and his other endeavors. Although Ken was taken from us far too soon, I guarantee his legacy will live on, both through his family as well as the millions of people who he's inspired, myself included. I think I speak for everybody watching this video when I say that we love and miss you, Ken, and we appreciate everything that you've done for us. Ride in peace, and I hope that you and Colin McRae are absolutely ripping it up in heaven together. Now, as my own small tribute to him, I'm going to focus this video on recreating 8 of Ken Block's iconic cars within GTA 5. While Ken Block obviously had a much larger collection of cars, I tried to focus this video on diversifying the builds that I did and included some builds you probably don't know about. Now, depending on any feedback that you guys give me, I'm happy to go back and recreate other cars of his, including the various Ford Fiesta and Focus cars that he's driven throughout the years. With that all being said, I'm going to get started with these builds. As always, feel free to skip around to the build that you'd like to see using the timestamps in the video's description. Alright, so for our first build, we're doing probably one of Ken Block's most iconic cars, the 1965 Ford Mustang Hoonicorn RTR. As you guys probably have seen, the Hoonicorn V1 was featured in Gymkhana 7, and a couple years later, the Hoonicorn V2 was featured in the Pikes Peak Gymkhana, both of which are obviously extremely popular videos. Now, as you guys could probably guess, to build this car in GTA 5, we're going to be using the Class A Drift Tampa, which takes its main inspiration from the real-world Hoonicorn, which is awesome, and you can buy the Drift Tampa from Southern San Andreas Super Autos for $995,000. Alright, so getting started with this Hoonicorn build, we're going to try to make this pretty quick. First off, for lights, we're going to leave the stock headlights as you guys can see there. Next up, for the neons, Ken Block's cars didn't have any, so we're going to leave those off. Next up, for the livery, we're going to choose the Ragarum livery. That allows us to get somewhat close to the monster livery that appeared on pretty much any variant of the Hoonicorn, and also has that subtle kind of background pattern, so that's obviously, I think, a direct reference to the liveries on the Hoonicorn, so I'd run this for sure. Next up, for the plate, you could pretty much run whatever you wanted here. I chose like a classic custom plate, but if you wanted to choose like something like Ken Block's personal plates, like Utah plates, you could run the blue and white too, but again, this is really down to your personal preference. Next up, for the respray, I would highly recommend choosing a matte color, more specifically the matte gray, as you guys can see here. So this basically allows you to get as close as possible to the dark shade of the Hoonicorn livery without totally muting that pattern. If I chose like a matte black, you would barely be able to see it. So I think a matte gray is definitely the way to go there for the primary. And then the secondary color, once again, we're also going to run a matte gray to match that up. That's really simple, so that's all good. Next up, we have the suspension. I chose the race suspension just to get the car as low as possible to the ground. Already the ride height is pretty ridiculous to begin with, so I think the race suspension gets rid of some of that wheel gap and makes it look a lot cleaner, so I chose this. So that's all good. And then next up, for the wheels. So as the car sits right now, it's going to be as close as possible to Hoonicorn V1. So in order to get these wheels that I've chosen, I went into the track category and I chose the Exos rims in the track category. That's really close as possible to the style of the wheels on Hoonicorn V1. And then I painted them a dark copper shade, as you guys can see here. So dark copper Exos rims with the stock tires, no lettering at all, is going to get you as close as possible to the Hoonicorn V1. And I think this is probably the most sensible build to make in GTA because this car has the velocity stacks. It doesn't have the exposed twin turbos like Hoonicorn V2 does. So I think this is probably the most accurate match you're going to get to any of Ken Block's cars as it sits in GTA. But if you want to recreate the first version of Hoonicorn V2, you're actually going to keep the exact same rims. So the first version of Hoonicorn V2 used the same rims as before. So once again, the Exos rims in the track category, and they're also going to be painted dark copper, as you guys can see there. Then for the second version of the Hoonicorn V2, he actually kept the same rims once again and then painted them frost white. So we're going to keep those Exos rims, and this time around we're going to swap the color to a frost white, as you guys can see here. So that's going to get you pretty close to the second version of Hoonicorn V2. And then we're also going to add this time around the Fukuru white tire lettering. So once again, for this version of the Hoonicorn V2, you're going to keep those Exos rims in the track category, you're going to paint them frost white, and you're going to add the Fukuru white tire lettering to get as close as possible to the Toyo tires text. So then there was another version of the Hoonicorn which actually had a totally different livery and a different set of wheels. Unfortunately, we can't get a good match to this livery, but we can change up the wheels. So for this, we're going to go into the street category this time, and we are going to choose the Hot Ring Steely wheels, as you guys can see here. I think that's probably the closest match you're going to get to the style of the rims on this car. So Hot Ring Steely there. And then for the color, we're going to keep that frost white color that we applied to the last set of rims that we put on this car. So frost white, Hot Ring Steely rims, and then we are going to leave off any sort of tire designs for this specific version of the Hoonicorn. For the very final version of the Hoonicorn, as it sits in the Hoonigan garage today, you're going to go back and change up the wheels again. We're going to go to the track category, and we're going to go all the way down to the black top blender wheels, as you guys can see here. So this is as close as possible to the final set of rims that are on the car today, the black top blender wheels in the track category. And this time around, we're going to go back in and we're going to add those Fukuru white lettering again. So that is pretty much every single variant of every single wheel that Ken Block ran on the Hoonicorn. Hopefully that helps depending on which version you want to recreate. I think the most faithful recreation in GTA is obviously Hoonicorn V1, going back to those dark copper rims that we ran over at the very start. But yeah, pretty much any variant is going to get you as close as possible to Ken Block's car. Tire smoke, should be left white just for realism's sake. And then finally for window tints, you can just leave off the window tint. And that is pretty much how you recreate every single version of the Hoonicorn RTR Mustang in GTA 5. Next up, we're going to recreate Ken Block's 1977 Ford F-150 Hoonitruck. This was another iconic and groundbreaking build of Ken's and was featured in the Route 66 scene in Gymkhana 10, as well as in Gymkhana 2, where Ken drifted it through Tiananmen Mountain in China. Obviously, to recreate the Hoonitruck here in GTA 5, we're going to use the Class A Drift Yosemite, which can be purchased for a trade price of $981,000 or for just over $1.3 million from Southern San Andreas Super Autos. So first off, in bumpers, we're going to choose a front bumper of the no bumper and chin spoiler, as you guys can see here. That's probably the closest match you're going to get here for the front. And then for the rear bumpers, you're going to do a plain and simple rear bumper delete there. So that's all good. Rear bumper delete. Moving back out, and next up we have the exhaust, and for this you're going to run the chrome tip exhaust, as you guys can see there. So that's all good. Next up for the grille, I chose the primary grille in D-Chrome. This is probably the best match you're going to get. Obviously, it's probably better to do the D-Chrome so that way you don't have the chrome around the headlights. So this is the best match you're going to get there. Next up for the hood, you're going to leave the hood stock. You don't want to modify this hood at all because either it's going to take away the twin towers or it's going to add some weird texturing. So the stock hood is definitely the way to go for this. Next up, we have the lights, and for the headlights here, we're going to leave the stock yellowed headlights, as you guys can see. And then Ken Block's car didn't have any neons, so we're going to leave the neons off. So that's all good. Next up for the livery, obviously the probably best match you're going to get here in GTA 5 is the Ragarum livery. Once again, it does add those big yellow and green stripes and the big graphic on the side, but it does have that subtle pattern behind it, which I think is probably the closest match you're going to get to the livery that was run on the Hoonitruck in real life. So that's all good. Next up, we have the plate, and for this, once again, that's kind of up to you. Well, actually, you don't even see the plate, so you don't really need to worry about the plate at all, because we've done the bumper modifications. The plate is not seen anymore, so don't need to worry about that, which is great. Next up for the respray, we're going to run pretty much the exact same respray that we did on the Hoonicorn. So we're going to go into matte, and we're going to choose a matte gray. Once again, this allows us to get the dark shade of the Hoonitruck's livery without totally muting that pattern. Once again, if I choose a black, then you wouldn't be able to see it at all. So matte gray there, and then for the secondary color, you're going to choose a matte gray once again. This is going to color, I think, yeah, just the roll cage in the back there. We'll get to that in a minute, but I think the matte gray is probably the best match to match it up with the rest of the paint on the car. That's all good. And then next up for the roll cage, I'd recommend running the reinforced bed because this gives that kind of roll cage look in the back there. So it's kind of the reinforcements without adding the huge high roll bar. I think the roll bar here, although it kind of matches the look of the supports on the left and right sides of the bed that were on the Hoonitruck in real life, I think it's just way too big and way too much. And the reinforced bed adds kind of the same aesthetic, but also adds the fuel cell, which I think just adds a little bit more detail, and in my opinion is the best match. So I'd recommend doing the reinforced bed here. Next up for the roof, we're going to run the stock roof, as you guys can see. That's all good. Next up for the spoiler, I'd recommend running the tall tailgate spoiler here. Really, I wish there was an option that was angled a little bit more downward and extended further back out, but the tall tailgate spoiler I think matches the kind of sizing of the wing on the Hoonitruck, so this is definitely the way to go. Next up we have the suspension, and for this I just chose the competition suspension to get as low as possible to the ground. The stock suspension is way too high, and I think the competition suspension just looks the best. So that's all good. Sun strips here, we're going to run the sun strip up front, as you guys can see there. Kind of syncs up with the livery, which is cool too. Next up, we have the truck bed, and for this I just left the stock truck bed. Any other one is going to look really off, and I just don't think it needs that much additional stuff added to it, so the stock truck bed I think is the way to go here. Next up, we have the wheels, and here's where, again, there's a bunch of variants, so I'm going to go through them in order. So for the Hoonitruck, the first version as it's sitting right now, the wheels you're going to run are in the street category, so we're going to go to street. And I think the most accurate match is the stanced EG custom wheels, so that way you get kind of the deep dish 5-spoke pattern, and that's probably the closest match you're going to get to the first variant of the wheels that were run on the Hoonitruck. So stanced EG custom in the street category, and then for the wheel color we're going to run a dark copper. Again, pretty much the same colorway as the Hoonicorn V1 as we just built, so pretty much the same colors carry over, so dark copper there. And this time around for the tire design we're going to choose the Fukuru white tire lettering right off rip, so that's going to get you as close as possible to the 1552 rims that were on the first variant of the Hoonitruck. So that's all good there. And then for the second version of the Hoonitruck that you guys see in this picture, we're once again going to keep those stanced EG custom wheels in the street category. So once again, street, stanced EG custom rims. And this time around, to get close to that, we're going to paint the rims a frost white. So as you guys can see here, changing them up to frost white, that's going to get you as close as possible to the variant of the Hoonitruck that was actually used in the Gymkhana film. So that's all good there, frost white, and then we are also going to keep the Fukuru white tire lettering, again for that variant. And then for the very final version of the Hoonitruck as it sits today, we're going to change up the rims again. This time around, we're going to go into the street category, and we're going to choose the Endo V4 dished, as you guys can see here. This kind of gives it the best dish look and keeps the 6 spokes. Another option I think that people might run here is in the track category, kind of similar to what I ran on the Hoonicorn, the blacktop blender wheels. You can also choose these. So either the blacktop blender or in the street category, we're going to go back to the Endo V4 dished. I personally like the Endo V4 dished just a little bit better. The 6 spokes are a little bit more prominent, and it doesn't have any, it has a really good deep dish, so I think these are probably the best match. But again, the other ones that I chose, the blacktop blenders, are also pretty close. But yeah, so these rims were the other ones I showed, and once again we're going to keep them frost white, as you guys can see there. And then we are also going to finally add the Fukuru white tire lettering. So yeah, that's pretty much every single wheel variant for all versions of the Hoonitruck, from the very first version to the wheels that are on the truck to this day. So that's all good there. Moving back out, tire smoke, we're going to leave that white obviously for realism's sake. And then next up we have the windows, and for this we're going to leave that tint off. And that is pretty much everything you'll need to recreate every single variant of Ken Block's Hoonitruck. Next up, we're going to recreate Ken Block's 2011 Ford Fiesta Gym 3, obviously in Gymkhana 3. This is the Ford Fiesta that Ken drifted around the ultimate playground in L'Autodrome, France, all the way back in 2010. To recreate this car in GTA 5, we're going to use the Vapid Flash GT, which you can purchase for $1.675 million from Legendary Motorsport. So let's get right into this build. First off, for the exhaust on this car, you're going to choose the side exits with the chrome trim around them, as you guys can see there. That's probably the closest match you're going to get to the side exits on Ken Block's car. So that's all good. Next up, for the front bumpers, you're going to leave that front bumper stock. You don't want to add anything to this, otherwise it's going to be way too low and it's not going to match the look of Ken Block's car. So just leave that front bumper stock. Next up for the hood, once again, we're going to leave that hood stock. The hood in its stock form is actually very close to the hood on Ken Block's car, which is great. So yeah, leave that stock. Next up for the lights, we're going to leave the stock lights as you guys can see. And then as we've done with other builds, we're going to leave those neons off. Next up, we have the livery, and for this, obviously, we're going to choose the Rum Racing 11 livery. People have used this also for other variants of Ken Block's Fiestas and Focuses, but it's a tried and true recreation of the Gymkhana 3 livery in specific, which is why I think, obviously, it's the best choice for this build. Next up for the plate, I chose the yellow on black custom plate, as you guys can see there, but again, that's pretty much down to your own personal preference, so that's all good. Next up for the respray, you're going to choose a primary color of a classic ice white. This might be confusing for some people, but the ice white is actually what goes under the livery. The livery adds the black stripes, not the white overlay, as you guys can see there. So for that purpose, obviously the primary color has to be the ice white. As you can see, that's how it changes. So ice white there for the primary color, and obviously that's a classic shade. And then for the secondary color, you're also going to go with a classic lime green this time around. So what this is going to do is this is going to color both the mirrors as well as the rear wing option that we've chose. And to get it as close as possible to Ken Block's car, which did have green mirrors as well as a green wing, you're going to choose a lime green there. So yeah, lime green there for the secondary, and then the trim color, which is the inside of the car. I think probably the graphite is the best way to go for this. And pretty much any other shade, I mean, they don't really change that much, so graphite's probably your best bet. Next up, moving back out, next up we have the roof, and for this we are going to do the Scoop V1 flag. Now, for whatever reason, Rockstar really botched this, and if you choose a different livery, not the one that we've already chosen, you can actually see an American flag on the roof scoop there. That's why it says livery required. But unfortunately, that doesn't work for the livery that's literally based off of Ken Block's car. You can't get the American flag with that as well. So that kind of sucks. That was definitely a huge oversight by Rockstar, and it stinks. But the Scoop V1, this variant of the Scoop, actually is as close as possible to the roof scoop that was on Ken Block's Fiesta. So we're going to run the Scoop V1, although we can't see that flag, which kind of sucks. Next up, we have the sun strips, and for this, you can pretty much run any sun strip that you want. I think Vapid Racing is probably the most accurate because it's a Ford, and there's all sorts of Ford branding or Vapid branding all over the car. So this one, but also the Chapal and Globe Oil stickers would also work because you see those sponsor stickers on the car as well. But I just kept it simple. You're going to want to do the sun strip, but you're kind of you can kind of make your own choice here. So that's all good there. Next up for the skirts, we're going to leave those skirts stock once again. A lot of the body on this car is going to stay stock. So yeah, that's good. Next up for the spoiler, this is where you're going to run to choose the secondary paint street wing, as you guys can see here. Any other wing is a little bit different to the style of the wing that was on Ken Block's Fiesta, and the secondary paint allows you to paint this lime green. It paints the entire wing lime green, which I know isn't the best match because Ken Block's car had some green elements and some white elements and some carbon, but I think probably the closest match you can get here in GTA is the secondary paint street wing there. So that's all good. Next up for the suspension, I recommend running the race suspension because you still get quite a bit of wheel gap, but it is more realistically lowered to the ground. I think the stock suspension is way too high, and I think to get it close to the stands as it appeared in Gymkhana 3, the race suspension is the way to go. So that's all good. Transmission, turbo, that's up to you. And then for wheels, there's only one wheel choice that I think would work the best for this. So first off, wheel type, we're going to go into the sport category. We're going to leave it stock so we can paint them. And you're going to go with the OG Endo V1 rims, as you guys can see here. This is as close as possible to, I think, the TE37s that were on Ken Block's car in real life. So the Endo V1 rims in the sports category. That's plain and simple there. And then for the wheel color, we're going to keep it simple and paint it lime green, so that way it matches both the mirrors as well as the wing, and obviously gets us as close as possible to Ken Block's car in real life. So that's all good there. Lime green on the wheels, and then the tires, we're going to do no custom tires this time around. And then tire smoke, leave it white. And then finally we have the windows, and for this you can just leave off those tints. So yeah, that's pretty much everything you'll need to recreate Ken Block's Gym 3 Ford Fiesta. Next up, we're going to recreate Ken Block's 1986 Ford RS200 Group B. This is based upon an actual Group B WRC homologation Ford RS200, as well as one that was equipped with Evo spec upgrades, so it was super rare. This was Ken Block's absolute dream car that he wanted to be race ready, but also street legal. Now for this recreation, we're obviously going to be using the Vapid GB200, which you can get for $940,000 off of Legendary Motorsport. First off, for the bumpers, we're going to go on the front bumpers and choose the fog light covers, as you guys can see here, to match the look of the hella lights that appeared on Ken Block's car in real life. Really, no other match here is going to be as close as the fog light covers, so we're going to choose these. Next up, for the rear diffuser, we're just going to remove that diffuser in the back there, so that way it's a little bit more open. That's all good. Moving back out, next for the chassis, we're going to choose the secondary cage because this is going to allow us to get pretty close to the secondary color in the interior, and it's also a pretty discreet cage. Ken Block's car did obviously have a roll cage because it's a Group B car and it's kind of required, but I think the secondary cage is definitely the way to go there. I don't know why primary cage appears after secondary cage. In the reality, they're the same, so secondary cage is your best bet there. Next up, for the exhaust, we're going to just leave the stock exhaust. Twin chrome is just way too much, and the stock matches the single exit on Ken's car, so that's all good. Next up, for the lights, we are going to leave these stock lights, as you guys can see, and once again, Ken Block's cars don't have neon, so we're just going to leave those off. That's all good there. Next up, we have the livery, and for this, obviously, we're going to choose the black stripes livery. You can see kind of the subtle striping here in the back there. This is by far the closest match you're going to get to the striping that's on Ken's car, so this is definitely the way to go for this build. Next up, we're going to do the mirrors, and for this, I just left these stock mirrors, as you guys can see. Next up, for the mudguards, we're going to leave off the mudguards. Although this was a rally car, Ken Block left the mudguards off, and in my opinion, it looks way cleaner with them off. So yeah, no mudguards there. Next up, for the plate, I ran the custom yellow on black plate, but again, this is pretty much down to you. If you wanted to get it closer to like a Utah plate that are on a lot of Ken's personal cars, you could use the blue on white 2 plate, but it's really down to your own personal preference there. Next up, we have the respray, and for this, we are going to choose a primary color. We're going to go into matte, and we're going to choose a matte gray once again. This allows us to kind of get that matte finish that was on the RS200 in real life without totally muting the stripes in the back. If you chose like a matte black, as you guys can see, you can barely see those stripes, and in my opinion, just kind of kills the use of the livery in the first place, so a matte gray is definitely the way to go. The light gray is way too much, so I think the matte gray for the primary is definitely the way to go here. And then for the secondary color, you're going to run a matte gray once again, because this is going to control the roll cage as well as the trim around the fog lights there and the trim on the doors. So to get that as close as possible to Ken's car once again, you're going to choose a matte gray. That's all good. And then finally, for the trim color on the interior, this is going to color the dash and some elements of the door panels and to some degree the seats. And because this car was pretty much all black inside, you're going to leave the trim color black. So that's all good. Moving back out, next up we have the sun strips, and for this we are going to run that GB200 sun strip across the front there. So that's all good. Next up we have the skirts, and for this we're going to leave those skirts stock. And then next up we have the spoiler, and for this we're going to run no spoiler. We already have kind of the big whale tail spoiler that's built into the bodywork of the car, and also the big roof scoop's already there. A lot of people do choose the roof spoiler, but I think it's too angular and it kind of cuts into the smooth lines of the roof line, so I think just leaving the spoiler stock is the way to go, and it still looks relatively close to an actual RS200 and the bodywork that was along the roof. So that's all good. Next up with the suspension, and once again I chose the race suspension. Stock is way too high, and I think race suspension still has enough of a wheel gap to look realistic, but it's also much cleaner looking, so race suspension definitely. And then next up we have the trunk, and for this I chose the vented scoop up front here. This is going to get you the look of the vents that are on Ken's car. Although the vents aren't in the same style, I think this is as close as possible you're going to get. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, Rockstar gave us like scoops like these, the vented rallycross, which look very close to Ken Block's car, although they get rid of the headlights for some weird reason. And there's no other option that allows you to preserve the look of the headlights while also having those scoops. So I don't know why that's the case, but you're kind of going to have to bite the bullet and choose the vented scoop there so you can keep the headlights but also get that scooped look. Either that, or you could just leave the stock trunk. That's kind of up to you, but I think the vented scoop kind of allows you to get somewhat close to that vented look while preserving the headlights. That's all good. Next up, turbo, that's up to you. And then wheels. So there were actually two variants of wheels that ran on this car. So for the first version of this car, as it appeared when Ken Block initially built it, I chose the retro 3-piece rims in the track category. So retro 3-piece I think gets the closest look to the turbofan rims that Ken had on his car. They have kind of the same pattern in terms of like the vents and the actual flat face itself, as well as the bolted look on the barrels on the outside of the rim. So the retro 3-piece I think is definitely the best match for the very first version of the rims that he ran on his car. And then the wheel color, we're going to choose a frost white, as you guys can see there. And then for the tire lettering, we are going to add the Fukuru white tire letters to get close to the Toyo Tires text. So that's all good there. And then the current version of the RS200 as it sits today, you're going to choose the blacktop blender wheels in the track category. So these wheels right here, nice 6-spoke with the turbofan look towards the outside. So these wheels are definitely the closest to the current wheels on the car. You're going to paint these frost white, as you guys can see there. And then you're also going to once again add the Fukuru white tire text, as you guys can see here. So that is for the second version of the car as it sits today. Ken Block always likes to switch up his wheels, so this is going to get you close to that variant of the car. But also if you want to do the very first version, then I showed that as well. So that's all good there. And then finally for the windows, we're going to leave the window tints off for this build. And yeah, that's pretty much everything you'll need to recreate Ken Block's Ford RS200 Group B car. Next up, we're going to be recreating Ken's 1978 Ford Escort Mk2 RS. This was Ken Block's first rear-wheel drive Gymkhana and tarmac rally car that he shredded a lot at the Burnyard and was built on one of his old Ford Escort Mk2 rally chassis. For this build, we're going to be using the Vapid Retinue Mk2 as it's directly based off of a Ford Escort Mk2, and you can purchase this car for $1.62 million from Southern San Andreas Super Autos, or about $1.2 million if you have the trade price unlocked. So moving right into this build, first off, for the front bumpers here, we're going to choose the street bumper there to get the kind of low look of the bumper on his car, as well as that additional splitter towards the bottom there. That I think is the closest match, either that or the track bumper. I choose against this one because it adds the like stilt supports there, as you guys can see. So either the track or the street bumper I think would work for the front. And then moving into the rear bumpers, you're going to leave that rear bumper stock because Ken's car still did have the original bumper look, but it was painted obviously, and it didn't have a diffuser down below. So yeah, definitely leave that rear bumper stock there. Next up for the grille here, I chose the primary housing on the headlights. Either this or the plastic housing would work. I chose the primary housing so that way it matched up with the rest of the color on the car, but either of these versions would work. Obviously, you're not going to want to run a carbon or the stock because they're chrome. So yeah, plastic or primary is the way to go there. Next up for the headlights, obviously you're going to want to run the cross tape here on the headlights for that classic rally look. Then next up for the hood, I just left the hood stock, as you guys can see there. The hood on his car was also stock, it just had that big American flag livery on it, so yeah, in order to keep it as close as possible to that, just leave it stock. Any of the other variants, just add too much to it. Next up for the lights, we're going to leave the stock headlights, as you guys can see there. That's all good. Next up for the livery, we're going to run no livery. I just left the livery off because there's really no variant of the livery you can get in GTA that's going to get you close to the American flag look and the Hoonigan kind of stickers towards the back. Some people choose the Vapid Classics livery because it adds the stripes, but it adds the stripes in the total wrong spot of the car. So I think just to keep it as clean as possible and to keep it as realistic looking as possible, I think just leaving the livery off is the way to go. Unfortunately, there's no version or there's no livery that will get you close to Ken Block's car. So that's all good there, no livery. Next up for the plate, I ran the yellow on black plate, as you guys can see here, but really this is down to your own personal preference. Next up we have the respray, and for the primary color I chose a matte black, as you guys can see there. Ken Block's car was also a matte black in addition to the satin on the livery, but to get as close as possible to the kind of full representation of the car's color, a matte black is definitely the way to go there. And then for the secondary color, once again, you're going to choose a matte black. That color's, well, pretty much nothing, but I think a matte black is definitely the way to go. Next up for the roll cage, you're going to want to run the Dash Dodger cage here. It gives you the full cage look, but it also is exposed on the interior, which really closely matches the look of the cage in Ken Block's car. Any of the other variants of the cage are kind of integrated into the dash, which is not as close as the Dash Dodger cage, so this is definitely the way to go. Full Dash Dodger cage there. Next up for the roof, we're going to run the Rally Scoop, as you guys can see. Although the Rally Scoop is slightly bigger than the look of the hood scoop on Ken Block's car, I think the styling of it still pretty closely matches. Either that or the Sunstrip, but I think the Sunstrip, I don't know, there is very clearly a scoop on his car, which is why I chose the Rally Scoop. I think that's more aesthetically important than the Sunstrip, and also the Sunstrip's just way too big in my opinion, so I think the Rally Scoop is definitely the better option here. Next up for the spoiler, you're going to want to run the primary ducktail at the back. Obviously keep it primary so that way it's actually colored with the rest of the car. And then all the others obviously are not the best match. So primary ducktail is the way to go. And then next up for the suspension, I ran the sport suspension just to get the car slightly lower to the ground. In its stock form, it's just way too high off the ground. Ken Block's car was actually decently low to the ground. And unfortunately, you can't really achieve that look in GTA without totally botching the wheel fitment with this extreme camber, not being able to fill the fenders. I think the sport suspension is kind of the best of both worlds. You kind of get a little bit more lowness than stock, but it doesn't mess up the wheel fitment as badly as the competition does. It's not the best, but it's the best we can get now in the game. So I think the sport suspension is the way to go. Transmission, turbo, that's up to you. And then we have wheels. So wheels, once again, there's a couple different variants of the wheels that were on Ken Block's car. So for this very first version of the build, we're going to go into wheel type, we're going to go into the tuners category, and we're going to choose stock rims so we can paint them, and you're going to choose the 5-star rims. This I think is very close to the 1552s that were on the first version of the Mk2 RS that Ken Block built. The 5-star rims just pretty closely match the 5-spoke look there. And then next up, we're going to paint them. So wheel color, we're going to choose a frost white. That's really plain and simple. And then we are going to leave the stock tires. We're not going to do any custom tire design. And then for the second version of the Mk2 RS as it sits today, we're going to go back into the tuners category and we're going to change the wheels up to El Quattro wheels. Now, although these have kind of the split spoke look, I think just the general design of the spokes themselves and the four kind of spoke design, although they're split, looks very, very close to the current versions of the wheels that are on Ken Block's car. So in my opinion, the tuner El Quattro rims are the best match here. And then once again, we're going to paint them. We're going to paint them a frost white once again. And then for this version of the wheels, because this version of the car did have tire letters, we are going to add the custom tires, as you guys can see there. So that I think is as close as possible of a wheel setup to the current version of the Mk2 RS as it sits today. So that's all handled. Next up, tire smoke, just leave it white. And then finally, for the windows, we're going to leave off the window tints, as you guys can see there. And that is pretty much everything you'll need to recreate Ken Block's 1978 Ford Escort Mk2 RS tarmac rally car. Next up, we're going to recreate Ken's 1985 Audi Sport Quattro replica car. This is one of his more personal builds and is a 730 horsepower replica of an Audi Sport Quattro that's built by LCE Performance. And although it wasn't used in any famous or popular Gymkhana video, in my opinion, it's still an amazing build and it sounds beautiful. Now, to recreate this car in GTA 5, we're going to be using the Obey Omnis, which can be purchased from Southern San Andreas Super Autos for $701,000. First off, going into the exhaust, we are going to leave the stock exhaust, as you guys can see there. Titanium tuner is just way too big, so I think stock is definitely the way to go. Keeps it nice and clean. Next up, we have the lights, and for the headlights, I'm going to leave those stock headlights, as you guys can see there. And then for the neon kits, I'm going to leave the neons off. That's all good. Next up, what we're going to do for the livery, we're just going to pull the livery off because Ken Block's car was pretty much fully white. There were the Audi logos on the sides there, but we can't get that in GTA, so I think taking the livery off is your best bet. Next up for the plate, this is pretty much down to you. I ran the blue and white 2 plate so I could get as close as possible to the Utah text on a lot of Ken Block's personal cars, so I ran blue and white 2 and my own custom plate to get as close as possible, but really this is down to your personal preference there. Alright, next up for the respray, we're going to do a primary color of a classic ice white there. Really plain and simple. I think this closely matches the bright shade of white that was on Ken Block's build. And then next up for the secondary color, I actually chose in the metals category a metal brushed steel. This might be kind of overkill. You might be able to find a pretty similar match in the classic category or maybe even the metallics, but I think the brushed steel gives the look of kind of the exposed metal towards the back of the car and the interior. It also paints the roll cage a pretty similar color there, so it kind of gives the chrome aesthetic on the roll cage as well as the back portion of the interior. And it's not too overkill, it's not too dark. Brushed aluminum might also work. I might actually choose a brushed aluminum there, but yeah, either brushed steel or brushed aluminum is going to give you the look of the kind of the exposed interior in the back, as well as the roll cage that's affected by the secondary color. And then next up we have the spoiler, and for this I actually took the spoiler off. In reality, the stock spoiler is just way too big. Obviously it's supposed to be a tribute to the original S1 Quattro, but Ken Block kind of kept his build a little cleaner, so I think to kind of match that clean aesthetic you might want to remove it. Either that or just leave it stock. I personally think, once again, stock is way too big, so might be the better option just to remove it and keep it clean. And obviously the OTT spoiler is just way too big, so yeah, either stock or just take it off. Next up for the suspension, I ran the sport suspension to get the car as low as possible to the ground, so that's really easy. Transmission, turbo, that's up to you. Next up for the wheels, for the wheel type, I chose in the track category the Rally monoblock here. This kind of gives the same look as the 5-spoke rims, as well as they have the little chrome barrel, and if you paint the wheels white, which I'll go over in a minute, it really closely matches and it makes the rims look like they're all white, which very closely matches the rims on Ken Block's car. They match in terms of the sizing and the actual spoke pattern itself. Either that or pretty much any 5-spoke. The Forge 5, some of these might work. The other main option I think would work is the Speedboy rims, although they're a little bit smaller, but still have a pretty similar look. Either the Rally monoblock or the Speedboy are pretty close. And then for the wheel color, these are actually pure whites now, but I'll show you anyway. I just took them off. But if you buy this car straight from the website, if you buy the Omnis straight from the website, they'll come by default in pure whites. But if you don't have that option, you can always paint them frost white as well. But I'm going to take that off just so I can keep the pure whites. And then for the tires, we're going to go into tire design, and we're going to choose the Fuguru white tire lettering. Once again, they get the close match to the Toyo Tires text that's on a lot of Ken Block's wheels. So that's all good. And then tire smoke, once again, just leave it white. And then last but not least, the window tints, I just left the tints off of this build. And yeah, that's pretty much everything you're going to need to recreate Ken Block's Audi Sport Quattro replica. Next up, we're going to recreate the 1974 Ford Bronco that Ken Block actually built for his wife as an anniversary gift, and this basically involved fully restoring and coyote swapping an old Ford Bronco chassis. Now for this build, we're going to be using the Declasse Yosemite Rancher. Although this car isn't directly based off of a Ford Bronco, you can still make the Yosemite Rancher look extremely close to it through its various exterior upgrades. The Yosemite Rancher is a Benny's vehicle, so you will need to purchase the original Yosemite from Benny's or Southern San Andreas Super Autos for $485,000, and then you'll need to do the Rancher upgrade in Benny's for an additional $700,000. So moving into this build, first off in the bull bars, we're going to go with the secondary single loop bar, as you guys can see there. It's going to give us those fog lights up top and also give us the look at that bull bar on his wife's car. Next up for the bumpers, we're going to choose in the front bumpers, we're going to go with the off-road ridge bumper up front here, so that way we get the similar styling of the bumper on her truck, as well as the tow hitch that looks very close to the one that's on her car. So off-road ridge bumper in the front there, and then for the rear bumpers, we're just going to do the simple rear bumper delete, as you guys can see, keep it nice and clean. Next up, we have the chassis, and first off for the skid plate, we're going to leave off the skid plate. In reality, I think running any of these is too much in terms of both the color as well as it being way too low to the ground, so I think the skid plate, just leave it off. Next up for the secondary light surround, you're going to want to leave this off once again. Next for the hood accessories, I chose the chrome hood catches, as you guys can see there. Next up, for the roll cage, you're going to want to go with the full padded roll cage. Although there's like an extra set of bars for this cage, it still is, I think, the closest match to the cage that was on her truck. Any of the others is really not the best match and doesn't extend as far as this one does, so the full padded roll cage is definitely the way to go there. So that's all good. Next up for the engine block, I'm just going to leave the stock engine block there. They really just left the stock 5.0 valve covers and everything like that in this build. So stock engine block there. For the air filters, just to clean it up a little bit and to not have the aggressive velocity stacks, I chose the chrome air filter, as you guys can see there, to kind of make it look stock. But really any of these, as long as it's not velocity stacks, so the twin air filter or the chrome is probably your best match there. Next up, engine tunes, that's obviously up to you. Moving on to the exhaust. For this, the side exit exhaust is definitely the way to go. You don't want any rear exit exhausts. They kind of were angled to the sides and they were chrome, so I think the side exits are the way to go there. So side exits. Next up for the fenders, I chose the Raptor flares. The reason why I chose these, although they have this weird kind of like bumpage, I think, around where the bolts go in, I think they're the closest possible to the flares on her truck. In addition to that, they are kind of angular, so they kind of give the illusion that the body's a bit more angular like the Bronco was. Either that or the street flares are pretty clean as well. The arc flares I wouldn't recommend. The street flares or the Raptor flares I think are the best match for that. But to, again, kind of make it a little bit closer to the Bronco in terms of styling, I think the Raptor flares are the best way to go. Next up for the grille, I choose the billet grille up front here to kind of cuddle up a little bit more than the stock grille does, which gives, again, the illusion that it's a little bit closer to the Ford Bronco in real life. So billet grille there. Next up for the hood, I chose the power bulge hood. Either that or you could just leave the hood stock. In reality, it did have kind of a shaker hood look, or like a pretty big vent on top, but you really can't get that look here in GTA. You might be able to pull it off using the Stinger hood, but I chose against that since it paints that section the secondary color. So either the power bulge or either that or stock would work pretty well. Next up, horn, that's up to you. For the interior here, first off for the ornaments, you're going to want to leave that off. Next up for the dials, I chose the negative dogfight dials to get closer to the style of the gauges on her car. So either the dogfight negative or the trash torquing, either of those pretty closely match the look of the Hoonigan text and the design that was on the gauges in her truck. So dogfight or trash torquing, the negative version, so it's black with the white text, is a pretty close match there. Next up for the seats, I chose the aluminum bucket seats. Although her car did have bucket seats, they weren't like aluminum. They were like full-on like racing seats with fabric. Unfortunately, you really can't achieve that look with either the other options. So either just leave them stock, like the stock bench seat, or you could do the aluminum bucket seat to get closer to the styling of the racing seats in her truck. You kind of have to bite the bullet and just make them aluminum for the sake of this build. So yeah, that's that. Next up for the steering wheels, there's really no good option here, but I think the closest match and the cleanest option to get as close as possible to the 3-spoke wheel in her truck is the street rod wheel, as you guys can see here. That's all good there. Column shifter levers, there was really nothing changed there, so we're just going to run none. Next up for the doors, you're going to want to leave this doors stock. If you do the quarter window, that's going to obviously get rid of the pillars there, so I think just leaving the door stock is closest match to the truck in real life. Next up for the light color, I chose an ice white. That's probably the best option you're going to get to allow the white to really shine on those gauge faces, so ice white there. Next up for the roll cage, we are going to choose the roll cage. This will cover basically the roll cage in the interior part of the truck rather than in the bed. So the roll cage is definitely the closest match you can get to the roll cage in the back. Either that or the padded. Because the roll cage on the truck in real life didn't have really any padding, I just left the stock roll cage there. Either that or you could run the padded one to match the second half of the cage over the bed. But yeah, roll cage there. Next up for the lights, for the headlights, we just left the stock headlights as you guys can see. And then once again, neons, just leave them off. That's easy. Next up for the livery, you're going to want to run no livery for this build. It was just a very, very clean and stock, just really nice, beautiful blue truck. So yeah, definitely leave the livery off for that. Next up for the plate, I chose the yellow on black plate, but in reality it doesn't really matter because you can't see it on either part of the truck, so you could just not worry about that at all. Next up for the respray, you could probably get a closer match with the crew color, but I personally chose a classic ultra blue to get as close as possible to the shade of blue on her truck. Nautical blue is close, but I think it's a little bit dark. I think ultra blue gives the same kind of brightness as the color on the truck in real life, and it's the closest match you can get in GTA 5. So yeah, classic ultra blue for the primary, and then for the secondary, you're going to go with a matte black, because this will color parts of the trim below the doors there, as well as the roll cage. So I think to get as close as possible to the black accenting on the Bronco in real life, the secondary matte black is the way to go. It'll match up with the fenders, it'll color the cage the right color and everything, so definitely a secondary matte black is the way to go there. And then for the trim color, this will color the parts of the interior here, the dash and everything like that. I think a black is the way to go because the car in real life had a fully blacked out interior. That's all good. Next up for the roof, we're going to run obviously no roof there, so that way it's fully exposed to the elements, probably the closest match we can get. No roof there. Next up for the snorkels, you're going to run no snorkel, obviously. It was pretty stock engine-wise, and there was still the stock intake setup, so just leave the snorkels off. Next up for the side step, you're going to run the Nerf bars. As you guys can see here, that's as close as possible to the side steps that were on her truck. So the Nerf bars there, nothing else. Next up for the sun strips, we're going to leave the sun strip off. Next, we have the suspension, and for this I left it stock, so it's as high off the ground as possible, so we have maximum ground clearance for off-roading. Next up, we have transmission, that's up to you. Truck bed, we're going to leave the stock truck bed. Anything pretty much here would make it look inaccurate. You could go with secondary, but that doesn't look that much different than the stock, so I think the stock is the way to go. And then for the trunk door, we're going to leave the stock trunk door, as you guys can see here. Either that or the run with the chrome branding. I think the chrome branding is too much, although there's the Ford emblem on her truck. I think the stock trunk door just looks the cleanest. And then a turbo, that's up to you. And then for the wheels, there were two variants of the wheels on this truck. So the very first version of this truck, in the off-roads category, I think the stock rims, the Mountain Man rims, are the closest match to the original 5-spoke rims that appeared on her truck. There's not really another close match in GTA 5. Maybe the Ridge Climber, either the Ridge Climber or the Mountain Man, are the closest match to the 5-spoke rims that were originally on her truck. I think the Mountain Man's a little bit better because it's a little bit more dished inward. But yeah, that's probably the closest match you're going to get there for those off-road rims, again, on the first version of her truck. And then we're going to back out of here and we're going to paint these rims black. In the lighting, the black doesn't really match the color on the body, but it's the darkest shade you can paint the rims, so you're going to kind of have to bite the bullet there and choose a black for the color on the wheels here. And then for the tires, you're going to run just these stock tires, as you guys can see. And then for the version of the Bronco as it sits today, we're going to swap out the rims. So we're going to go back to off-roads. We're going to go to stock so we can paint them. And the other version of the rims on her truck were the concave steely wheels, as you guys can see here. This kind of gives that steely look, and it also has the kind of holes that are concentrically on the outside of the face of the rim. So I think that's probably the closest match there to the version of the rims on the truck in real life as it sits today. So concave steelies, and then once again we are going to paint them black, and we are also going to leave the tire letters off. So yeah, that's pretty much everything in the tires. Tire smoke, leave it white. And then finally for the windows, we're going to run no window tint. And then that's everything you'll need to build Ken Block's wife's Ford Bronco here in GTA 5, obviously in Benny's. And last but not least, we're going to recreate Ken Block's 2017 SVC off-road Ford Raptor F-150. This was one of his personal builds that he used for off-roading in Utah. It was also one of SVC Off-Road's own testing vehicles to be used for the aftermarket parts that they developed, so naturally it was pretty heavily modified all around. Now for this recreation, we're going to be using the Vapid Cara 4x4, which can be purchased for $875,000 off of Southern San Andreas Super Autos. So first off, for this build, moving right into the bumpers. For front bumpers, we're going to run the secondary racing bars, as you guys can see there. Gives a look at the bars, adds some extra fogs up front, and it also has the skid plate at the bottom there, so secondary is definitely the way to go, and we'll paint that later on. Next up for the rim bumpers, we're going to run the secondary roll bar rear bumper to kind of give it that look with the exposed bars in the back. You could either run black or secondary. I think to match it up with the rest of the coloring that we're going to run later, I think the secondary is the way to go. So that's all good. Next up for the exhaust, you're going to run the stock exhaust there, kind of the stock side exit exhaust that you guys can see. So stock exhaust there is the best match. Next up for the fenders, there are actually two different variants of the fenders that were on this truck because this car was kind of modified progressively over the years that Ken owned it. So for the very first version of the truck as it appeared, you're going to run the stock secondary fenders, as you guys can see there. So the stock secondary fenders are the closest match to kind of the exposed plastic trim on the fenders. And then for the current version of the car as it appears today, you're going to want to run the stock primary fenders because when they modified it again, then they matched the fenders to the rest of the body color. So first version, do the secondary, and then for the second version, just switch to the primary depending on which variant you guys want to recreate. So yeah, that's simple. Next up for the grille, we're going to run the Vapid large graded grille up front there to kind of get the classic look of the embossed text there on the front grille. Plain and simple. Next up for the hood, we're going to run the single vent secondary. Although it has the exposed bolts there, I think the style of the hood itself is the closest match. And we can also sync that up again with the secondary color, which is nice, and I'll go over that in a minute. But single vent secondary hood. And then for the horn, that's up to you. Lights, for the headlights here, we are going to run the xenon headlights, kind of brighten them up just a little bit, give it a little bit more of a modern look. And the whole kind of emphasis behind this truck was throwing as much light as possible. So I think the xenon lights are kind of a good way for us to recreate the kind of purpose of all the lighting on this car in real life here in GTA 5. So xenon lights there, neon kits, we're just going to leave those off. And then next up we have the livery, and for this, for the first variant of the truck, it kind of had a very discreet livery towards the back end. It was kind of the bed, the sides of the bed were colored with like a white Hoonigan graphic. Unfortunately, we cannot get that in GTA 5 here. But I think he changed up the livery in the second version of the truck. So I think to get a little bit closer to the version of that livery on the second version of the truck, the rear vapid angle stripes will get you kind of close. The coloring doesn't match that much, but it does give a little bit extra to the paint and it doesn't look as basic. So if you wanted to recreate that variant of the truck with that livery, then you could run the rear vapid angle stripes there. That's the most discreet, but also kind of just adds a little bit more variation to the color scheme on this car. Any of the others I think are way too much. So yeah, either just no livery or the rear vapid angle stripes is the way to go there. Next up we have the plate, and for this you're going to want to run the blue and white 2 plate. This will give you the classic text that looks kind of like the Utah plate that was on Ken Block's truck, because once again he used it for off-roading in Utah, so definitely the blue and white 2 plate is the way to go there. Next up for the respray, this is actually a pretty simple respray. So to match the shade of this color on his truck, which was actually a Ford gray color, I believe, you're going to want to run a primary color of a classic frost white. Although this color technically is white in the right lighting, as you guys can see here, it does look a tinge gray. So I think this is as close as possible to the very light shade of gray on Ken Block's truck in real life. So frost white there for the primary. And then for the secondary color, we're going to run a matte gray. So this matte gray is going to allow us to color the fenders as well as the hood and also the roof. And this I think is as close as possible to the variant of the truck in real life. And yeah, I think the matte gray or the matte black, it really doesn't change a lot, but I think either version, matte black or matte gray, would get you close to that variant of the truck as it sits in real life. So that's all good there. Next up for the roof, you are going to want to run the secondary roof. Although the roof on his truck in real life wasn't fully colored like a black color, in reality it was only like a portion of it. I think the closest match you're going to get in GTA is to color it secondary, so that's the best match there. Next up for the racks, you're going to run the stock rack. Although the car did have kind of pre-runner modifications in the bed there, it had like some reinforcements in the back and exposed like tires and stuff like that. You really can't get any closer to that using any of the rack modifications here in GTA, so I think just leaving the stock rack is the best way to go for that, although it is a little bit boring. So yeah, next up for the suspension, we're going to leave the suspension stock so it's as high off the ground as possible. We get maximum ground clearance there. Okay, next up, transmission, turbo, that's up to you. Wheels. So there's actually two variants, once again, of the wheels that were on this truck, both of which are in the off-roads category. So in the off-road section, stock rims, obviously, so we can paint them. The very first version of the truck had the 5-spoke rims that actually look pretty similar to the wheels that were on Ken Block's wife's Bronco. So to get as close as possible to those first set of wheels that were on this truck, I think the Mountain Man rims in the off-roads category are the best match. They give the 5-spoke look. They're also pretty deep inset wheels in terms of like their depth. So I think this is pretty close for those rims. And then backing out of here, we're also going to paint these a black. Again, although it doesn't really match the black that's on the rest of the body, it's not fully dark. The black here for the wheel color is the closest you're going to be able to get. So paint those black for those first set of rims, and then for the tires, you can just leave these stock tires. And then for the current version of the truck as it sits, we're going to go back into off-roads and we're going to swap these rims out for the flat 6 rims. So as you guys can see there, these 6-spoke rims look pretty modern, look kind of almost like deep dish TE37s, but this is going to be the closest match you can get to the 6-spoke rims that are on the truck in its current state. So the flat 6 or the Mountain Man, depending on the version you want to recreate. And yeah, once again, we're going to paint these rims a black color. And that's really about it. For the tire design on the second set of rims, we're going to run the stock tires once again. And that's really about everything there. And then finally for the window tints, I just ran a light smoke to kind of match up with the OEM tint that was on these Raptors by Ford. Anything else I think is a little bit too dark, so I think light smoke is definitely the way to go there. And that is everything really that you'll need to recreate Ken Block's SVC off-road Ford Raptor. And that will conclude all of the builds that I wanted to cover in this video. Hopefully it was helpful in showing you guys everything that you need to recreate some of Ken Block's coolest cars. As always, feel free to drop any feedback on these builds and leave any additional ones that you'd like to see down below in the comments. As always, thank you guys so much for supporting my channel and watching this video, and an even bigger thanks to Ken Block for the years worth of passion and inspiration that helped to spark my passion in cars and the creation of my YouTube channel. I will see you guys in the next video.